one of the really useful things to understand, and this took me a long time to formulate properly. You know, you hear the terror management theorists, for example, and they have this idea that your meaning representation, the story you tell about the world, regulates your death anxiety. It's something like that. But that's not right. I mean, it's close to right, and it's a smart idea. It came from Ernest Becker, by the way, who wrote a book called The Denial of Death, which is actually quite a good book, even though it's wrong. You know, sometimes a book can be very useful. It can be usefully wrong, and Becker's book is usefully wrong, because he thought that it's the internal representation of your belief system that regulates your anxiety, and that anxiety is fundamentally, in the final analysis, anxiety about death. It's like, well, okay, fine, it's a reasonable proposition, but that isn't how it works, you see. It isn't my beliefs right now that are regulating my emotion. It's the fact that I'm acting out those beliefs, which include implicit perceptions. I'm acting them out, and so are you. And so what you're doing and what I expect, more accurately, what you're doing and what I want you to do, and the way I want you to react to me, that's working. So it's the match between my belief system and the way everyone else is acting that's regulating my emotions. It's not the belief system. It's mediated by the social culture, and you see, if you understand this, then you understand more particularly why people are willing to fight to the bitter end to protect their culture. It's not a psychological structure that they're protecting. It's a psychological structure and a sociological structure simultaneously. So the social contract is, you have a set of expectations and I have a set of expectations. They're actually desires. They're not merely expectations, because as living creatures we're desirous. We don't just expect. And so you desire an outcome and I desire an outcome. And we agree to act in accordance with that. That's the social contract. And so people don't like having that disrupted. Well, it isn't because it psychologically destabilizes them, although it does. It's because it actually destabilizes them, right? If all of a sudden we can't occupy the same specified domain of territory, it isn't only that we're thrown into psychological disarray, although we will be, it's that we'll start fighting with each other, like, and that can kill you. It's no joke. It kills people a lot. Like, it can happen very easily that a cohesive social group can fragment along some fracture line of identity, let's say, and all hell breaks loose. You know, that's what happened with the Tutsis and the Hutu in Rwanda, you know, and those things can get out of control just so fast. It's just unbelievable. And that wasn't death anxiety, that was death. That's a whole different thing, and that's the other thing the terror management people don't exactly get. It's like, it isn't just that your culture and your cultural beliefs protect you from anxiety, and say anxiety about death even, it's that they actually protect you from death as well as protecting you from death anxiety. I mean, look, it's warm in here, it's cold outside. The fact that the culture is intact means that you're not outside freezing. That's a hell of a lot more fundamental in some sense than mere anxiety, although I'm not trying to underplay the role of anxiety. That's a major issue, but there's something that's a lot more fundamental at stake than mere psychology. So it's the match between your map of the world and other people's actions that regulates your emotion. And it regulates it completely, because, you know, if someone in here started acting seriously deranged, like brandished a pistol, let's say, all of a sudden you would not be in the same place at all, not a bit. And so what would happen? Well, chaos would happen. And chaos isn't just that you would get anxious. That's not a good enough explanation. What would happen is more complex than that. What happens in some sense is that your body, and it does this, what would happen is that you would react the same way that a rat reacts to a cat. It's exactly that. It's exactly that. You would respond as if a terrible predator had emerged in your midst. And so what is that reaction? Well, it's not just anxiety, because when you encounter a predator, anxiety isn't the only thing that's useful. That just makes you freeze. It's like, that could be the worst thing you could do. You freeze and, well, you're a pretty easy target. So you have to be prepared for a lot broader range of responses than mere petrification. Like, how about a little aggression? That might be helpful. You don't know, it also might get you killed, but you know, maybe you can take the guy down, and maybe that's a good idea, you know, and maybe you have to run, so that's disinhibited as well, and maybe you have to think really quickly and reflexively, so that happens, that's activated, disinhibited, I would say, as well. It's like your whole being is thrown into intense concentration on the moment, and you're burning up physiological resources like mad. And so what will happen after something like that, if you don't develop outright post-traumatic stress disorder, which some of you would, is that you'd, assuming that the situation was brought under control, you'd walk out of here shaking with your heart rate at like 170, and it would take you like, well, it might take you the rest of your life, and maybe you would never recover, but you could bloody well be sure that it would take you the rest of the day, that's for sure. And so it's no joke when someone steps outside the confines of the social contract, right? And that's kind of, there's a philosopher named Hobbes, who I suppose in some sense was a centrally conservative philosopher as opposed to Rousseau, who's kind of his exact opposite. Rousseau believed that people were basically good in their natural state, so he believed nature was basically good, and he believed that culture was what corrupted people, Thomas Hobbes believed exactly the opposite. He believed that in the state of nature, let's say, every person was at every other person's throat, and the only thing that prevented continual chaos was the imposition of a collective agreement, that would be the social contract, that essentially governed how people would interact, and that would keep that underlying chaos at bay. And you know, my contention is that Hobbes was correct and Rousseau was correct, and I think that if you add Rousseau and Hobbes together, you get a total picture of the world, and that's really, I think, the picture of the world that I'm trying to relate to you. It's both at once. It's like, well, you can't just attribute human malevolence and unpredictability to society. It's a non-starter. It's like people built society, so all you're doing is pushing the problem back. It's like, where did it come from? Well, the society before, well then the one before that. It's like, well, you got to tangle up the individual in there at some point because people created society. And so you can't just blame human irrationality and malevolence on society. Well, and also it's ungrateful, for God's sake. It's like society obviously also makes you peaceful. Part of the reason you're peaceful right now, all of you, is because, well, you're not that hungry. You're certainly not starving to death. You would be a very, very different person if you were starving right now, you know, or if you were enraged, or if you were panicking, or if you were terrified because your future was radically uncertain. I mean, you're just not any of those people right now. You're satiated, and I mean that technically, you're satisfied. None of your biological systems, except perhaps curiosity, which is a rather pleasant emotion, are activated in the least. And you know, because of that, you all think, well, you're in control of yourself, but don't be thinking that. That's just not right. I mean, if you look at how the brain is structured, for example, the hypothalamus, which is a really important part of the brain, it basically establishes the framework of reference and the actions, the framework of reference within which and the actions you take in order to fulfill basic biological needs. So the hypothalamus makes you thirsty, and the hypothalamus makes you hungry, and it makes you sexually aroused, and it puts you into a state of defensive aggression, and it actually also makes you explore and be curious. All of that's hypothalamic. It's an amazing structure, and it's really small, and it's right at the base of the brain. And you can imagine it as something that has tremendously powerful projections upward throughout the rest of the brain into the emotional systems and the cortical systems and all of that, like tree trunk sized connections, you know, metaphorically speaking. And then the cortex has these little like vine like tendrils going down to regulate the hypothalamus, you know, and if it's, when push comes to shove, man, the hypothalamus, that thing wins. And so, you know, you get people now and then who have a hypothalamic dysfunction, and one of them produces a condition called, I can't remember it, it's not dipsomania, although it's like that, doesn't matter. It produces uncontrollable thirst. And so what will happen is that people who have this hypothalamic problem will drown themselves by drinking water, which you can do, by the way. And so they just cannot get enough water. and there's no stopping them, right? No more than there would be stopping you if you were suffering from raging thirst. It's like, it's a happy day when the hypothalamus is not telling you what to do. And you know, you live in such a civilized state that most of the time, roughly speaking, you're tranquil and satisfied, and more or less you can imagine yourself as a peaceful, you know, productive, well-meaning entity. But don't be thinking that that's what you'd be if you were put in the right situation, because that's just not right at all.